Namaste and welcome to Daily News Simplified, the what, why and how of newspaper reading. Today we would be analyzing the Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper of 27th January 2018. Now let us begin. Now from page 1, the first news we would be analyzing is on India-ASEAN relations. Now this news has further been continued on page 5, page 8, page 9 and the editorial page on page 11. Now in the article from page 1, India should be proactive, ASEAN. There are two different terms that have been used, Asia-Pacific region, which has been used by the ASEAN group, and the term Indo-Pacific region, which has been used by India. Now both these terms mean very different things. So let us first understand the difference between them. And after this, what we'll do is get a brief background on India-ASEAN relations. Now let us first understand the difference between Asia-Pacific and Indo-Pacific. Now we have taken this image from the December edition of the Focus magazine. Now both these terms, Asia-Pacific and Indo-Pacific, basically mean the confluence of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. So in geopolitical terms, if you look at this image, the saffron line till the Hawaii Islands in the Pacific Ocean and the country of New Zealand in the region of Oceania and to the Straits of Malacca. Now this region, from the Strait of Malacca to the Oceania region to the islands of Hawaii up till the point of Japan, this area compromises in geopolitical terms as the Indo-Pacific region. And in terms of confluence of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, what this region primarily comprises of is the South China Sea. While again in the image, if you take a look at the red dotted line, this region comprises of what is called the Persian Gulf till the eastern coast of Africa, and again further compromises the Oceania region up till the islands of Hawaii in the Pacific Ocean. Now the primary difference between Indo-Pacific and Asia-Pacific is the Arabian Sea and the western half of the Indian Ocean. Now hopefully up till here, you've gotten a pictorial understanding of the Indo-Pacific region and the Asia-Pacific region. You also further understand as to what is the primary focus point of the Indo-Pacific region, and you also understand what is the difference between the Asia-Pacific and the Indo-Pacific region. Now India has used the term Indo-Pacific because currently we're engaging with the ASEAN nations only in the Indo-Pacific region, and we have yet to engage with the ASEAN nations in what is the larger Asia-Pacific region. Now the difference between Asia-Pacific and Indo-Pacific is mainly towards a basic understanding of what these both terms mean, and you should be careful when you use these terms in your mains examination paper. Now let us understand a brief about the India-ASEAN relations. Now there are 8 points in the India-ASEAN relations which we would be focusing upon, and through these 8 points you'll get a brief understanding and specifics on India-ASEAN relations. Now the first point is the Act East policy. Now as you may know, P.V.R. Narasimha Rao in the early 90s led to the Look East policy, and the current government of Narendra Modi in 2014 upgraded the Look East policy to the Act East policy. Now this policy was upgraded at the India-ASEAN summit held in Nai Pai Tao in Myanmar. Now ASEAN is considered the main regional grouping of engagement for India under its Act East policy. So if a question is asked in your prelims examination that at which of the following summit was the Look East policy upgraded to the Act East policy, you would know that it was the 2014 India-ASEAN summit held in Nai Pai Tao in Myanmar. Moreover, you also understand on how the Act East policy has made ASEAN the lead group of engagement for India in Southeast Asia. Now moving on to the second point. Now the ASEAN India Green Fund was set up in 2010. Now this Green Fund aims to support cooperative pilot projects between ASEAN and India for promotion of technologies aimed at promoting adaptation and mitigation of climate change. Now this fund was set up with an initial contribution of $5 million. So hopefully up till here, you've understood as to what is the ASEAN India Green Fund, when was it set up, and what is its main purpose. Now let's move on to the third point. Now the ASEAN India Science and Tech Development Fund was set up in the year 2007. Now this fund was established to encourage research and development and technology development between ASEAN and India. So hopefully up till here, you understood as to when was the ASEAN India Science and Tech Development Fund was set up and what is its main purpose. Now let's move on to the fourth point. Now the Master Plan on ASEAN Connectivity was adopted in 2010. Now this Master Plan focuses on India's support to ASEAN connectivity. Now in the year 2016, at the 28th ASEAN Summit, the Master Plan on ASEAN Connectivity 2025 was adopted and replaced the earlier Master Plan on ASEAN Connectivity of 2010. So hopefully you understand the purpose of the Master Plan on ASEAN connectivity. You also understand its most recent development in 2016. Now moving on to the next point. Now connectivity has been the major theme between India-ASEAN relations and forms a part of what is called the three C's of India-ASEAN relations, which are culture, connectivity and commerce. Now as you may know, India is currently forming the India-Myanmar-Thailand trilateral highway. Now it has been proposed that this trilateral highway will be extended towards Laos, Vietnam and Cambodia. And this decision was recently taken in 2016. So hopefully from this, you also understand why connectivity is important in India-ASEAN relations, what is meant by three C's, and what is the most recent development to the trilateral highway. So if a question is asked in your prelims examination, such as which of the following are members of the trilateral highway, you know that the answer is India, Myanmar and Thailand. Or if a question is asked, onto which countries the India-Myanmar-Thailand highway is being extended to, you would know that the answer is Laos, Cambodia and Vietnam. Now we move on to the next point. Now the ASEAN-India Cooperation Fund was formed in the year 2009 and it was formed to support the implementation of the ASEAN-India Plan of Action. Now we would be understanding more about Plan of Action in the last point. So hopefully up till here you have understood as to when was the ASEAN-India Cooperation Fund formed and what is its main purpose. Now moving on to the next point. Now India signed a free trade agreement with ASEAN in goods in 2009 and a free trade agreement in services and investment in the year 2014. Now apart from this, India is currently in negotiations under the Regional Cooperation in Economic Partnership Platform or RCEP with ASEAN and other members in forming a regional FTA. Now to further understand about RCEP, it has been covered in depth in the DNS of 23rd January and you can refer to that video to get a further understanding of the RCEP agreement. Now moving on to the next point. Now the Plan of Action is an important reference point in India-ASEAN relations. Now the Plan of Action is intended to implement the ASEAN-India partnership for peace, progress and shared prosperity. Now the current Plan of Action of 2016 to 2020 was adopted in the year 2015 and it comprises of three broad priorities on which the future relations between India and ASEAN would be trajected on. The first is political and security cooperation. The second is economic cooperation. And the third is socio-cultural cooperation. So hopefully up till here, you have understood as to what is the Plan of Action between India and ASEAN, what is its purpose, when was the current Plan of Action between India and ASEAN signed, and what are its three main priorities. Now suppose if a question is asked in your mains examination, which is simply straightforward as explain India-ASEAN relations. Now to answer that question, you need to remember these 8 points so that your mains answer showcases depth and knowledge in front of your UPSC examiner and would differentiate your answer from rest of the crowd. Now with this, we move on to the next article. Now I have taken this news from page 8. Now what this article talks about is the impeachment process for the Supreme Court judges. Now we would not be analyzing the political part of this news, but what we would understand from your prelims perspective on how a judge of the Supreme Court is impeached. Now if I were to ask you a question as to which article of the Constitution of India refers to the impeachment procedure of the Supreme Court judge, you should know that it is Article 124. Now let us understand this article with the help of the Constitution of India itself. Now Article 124, Part 4 gives the procedure of the impeachment of a judge of a Supreme Court. Now to begin the impeachment procedure in the Parliament, a resolution has to be introduced. Now this resolution has to be introduced either by 100 members of the Lok Sabha or either by 50 members of the Rajya Sabha. Now after this, a discussion is held in the Parliament, and if the Parliament collectively decides to impeach the judge of the Supreme Court, the resolution has to be supported by a majority of the total membership of that House and by a majority of not less than 2/3 of the members of that House present in voting. Now if the resolution has been passed, it has to be presented to the President in the same session for the President's approval. Now hopefully up till here you have understood as to under which article does the impeachment of a Supreme Court judge falls, how a resolution to impeach a Supreme Court judge is introduced, and what are the specific conditions for the impeachment of a Supreme Court judge. So if a question is asked in your prelims examination, such as which of the following statements are correct, you can answer from the information given in this section. Now we move on to our next article. Now we have taken the lead editorial from page 6. Now this article is simple in terms of language and in terms of content. Now what this article has taken for granted is that the 21st century would be the Asian century, and then makes certain points at what should be India's foreign policy with regards to China in this Asian century. So the first thing we'll do is first understand as to what is meant by the term Asian century. And then I'll give you a brief overview of the two main points that the author makes. Now let us first understand as to what is meant by the Asian century. Now as you might know, the 19th century was referred to as the European century, or in particular, the British century, while the 20th century has been referred to as the American century, while the 21st century, which is currently going on, has been referred to as the Asian century by the author and by several others, but is yet to be seen. Now the question is as to what made the 19th century as the British century, or the 20th century as the American century, and what would make the 21st century as the Asian century. Now there are three important parameters. First is political influence, the second is economic influence, and the third is cultural influence. Now in international relations, the first two are referred to as hard power, while the third point is primarily referred to as soft power. Now the hegemony of these three influences. Now by the term hegemony, we mean leadership or domination. So by having political plus economic and cultural influence, a country is able to establish its hegemony over other countries. So in the 19th century, the British Empire was able to establish its hegemony over other countries. So one example of its political influence would be its large naval base. In terms of its economic influence, would have been its ability to lead the Industrial Revolution. And in terms of its cultural influence, would have been its implementation of the English language. Similarly, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, America was able to establish its dominance by having one of the largest defense budgets, by dominating through its economic influence, by making the American dollar the reserve currency of most of the countries, and by improving its cultural influence through the policy of capitalism, Hollywood, development aid programs, and others. So hopefully up till here, you have understood as to why the 19th century was called the British century, why the 20th century came to be known as the American century, what three parameters are needed to establish dominance. And now we come to the question as to why should the 21st century be the Asian century. Now the term Asian becomes problematic because of the competition between India and China. Now in the 19th century, there were multiple powers such as British Empire, French, Portuguese, Italians, but the 19th century came to be known as the British century because it became the dominating power. While similarly in the 20th century, you had the Soviet Union, you had the United States, but by the early 90s, it came to be known as the American century. So similarly, the question becomes as to why the 21st century shouldn't just be India's century, or why couldn't it be just Chinese century? Now the answer to this question has been given by the author in this lead article. Now according to the author, India should bond strategically with China. The author further highlights that India should become equidistant from the United States and China. And this is because that India should showcase China that it is not trying to contain it, and its relation with the US, such as the recent quadrilateral group, should not be seen as being anti-China. The third point that the author makes is that India and China should solve their bilateral issues. Now according to the author, India and China should follow a give and take model and should solve their bilateral issues while still maintaining their national interests. And the fourth point that the author makes is that China should not influence its relation with India with regards to Pakistan, wherein China should drop its objection to the Maulana Masood issue in the United Nations Security Council and similarly understand India's problem with the recent China-Pakistan economic corridor. Now hopefully you understand all these 4 points that the author has made as to how India and China can cooperate to make the 21st century an Asian century. So hopefully up till here you have understood as to what is meant by the term Asian century and how the cooperation between India and China can achieve it. So if a question is asked in your main examination, such as the advent of the Asian century is dependent upon the trajectory of the relations between India and China, comment, you would be able to answer with the explanation given in this section. Now we move on to our next article. Now this news we have taken from page 11. Now as mentioned earlier, RCEP has been covered in depth in the DNS of 23rd January 2018. And moreover, Master Plan for 2025 has been covered in an earlier section of this video, including the India-Myanmar-Thailand Trilateral Highway and others. And therefore, we move on to our next article. Now we have taken this news from the editorial page on page 6. Now let us first understand as to why is it in the news. Now the article talks about the rising oil prices and its impact on the Indian economy. Now the article gives two reasons for the rise in oil prices. Now the first reason is that international oil prices have been rising for some time. The OPEC cartel, or the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, consists of members who are the largest suppliers of oil around the world, such as Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, among others. Now, for the past 1 year, OPEC has cut down the supply of oil so as to increase the prices of oil in the international market. And as a result, prices have increased from $45 per barrel in the June of last year to $70 per barrel as of now. Now, the second reason given in this editorial for the rise in oil prices is that there has been a weakening or a depreciation of dollar in international foreign exchange markets. Now, depreciation refers to the decline in the value of one currency in terms of another currency. Now, if you consider an example, let's say $1 is worth 50 rupees in the current exchange rate. Now, if $1 changes to 40 rupees, then this shows that dollar has depreciated as the dollar is worth less rupees now. So hopefully up till here you have understood as to why is it in the news, what are the two causes of the rise in oil prices. Now let us understand its impact on the Indian economy. Now the first point is that crude oil forms one of the biggest items of imports in India. So a rise in crude oil prices will lead to an increase in India's current account deficit. Now the second impact would be that since oil prices is de-administered in India, which means that it is based on the forces of market demand and supply, the impact of rise in global prices leads to a rise in domestic consumer price. Therefore, the retailing price of both petroleum and diesel would increase. Now the third impact on the Indian economy would be that high global oil prices may result in the increase of the fiscal deficit of the government. Now this may happen due to cuts in excise duties provided by the government of India to release the burden of the marketing oil companies and therefore to prevent domestic oil prices from increasing. Now hopefully up till here you have understood the 3 points that the article makes on the impact of the rising oil prices on the Indian economy. Now from this article, remember 2 points. First is on how the depreciation of the US dollar leads to rise in oil prices, and the second is the impact of increasing oil prices on the Indian economy. And both these points become relevant from your UPSC prelims and mains examination. Now we move on to our next article. Now we have taken this news from page 11. Now what this article talks about is the Atal Pension Yojana. Now the Atal Pension Yojana is a pension scheme for the unorganized sector. Now this scheme was launched in 2015 and intends to provide a guaranteed pension from Rs 1000 to Rs 5000. Now hopefully up till here you have understood the basic features of the Atal Pension Yojana. Now let us understand as to why is it in the news. Now it is in the news because the government of India has allowed small finance banks and payment banks to offer Atal Pension Yojana. Now the question is why? Now these small finance banks and payment banks have been allowed to offer Atal Pension Yojana so as to increase its outreach. So hopefully up till here you've also understood as to why is it in the news, and you also understand as to why small finance banks and payment banks have been allowed to offer Atal Pension Yojana. Now with this we come to an end in the analysis of today's paper. Now we move on to the question for today.